Zootopia, pre-write version. Before Zootopia became the witty, colorful allegory about prejudice we know today, it was much darker. Early drafts placed the story in a world where predators were forced to wear shock collars that delivered painful jolts whenever they acted too wild. The collars were a literal tool of oppression, and the film would have centered on Nick Wilde navigating this dystopian system. Disney even produced test animation and concept reels, some of which were shown at early presentations. The imagery of animals joylessly putting on collars is still floating online in leaked concept art. The tone, however, was considered too intense for family audiences. Executives decided to shift the focus, making Judy Hopps the protagonist and dropping the shock collar subplot. To this day, fans debate whether a darker version of the film would have been more powerful, and they continue searching for complete animatics from this early draft. Frozen early drafts. Before Frozen became one of Disney's most successful films, it went through decades of failed drafts and abandoned concepts. The story was originally meant to be a direct adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen. Early versions kept Elsa as a cold and cruel villain, closer to the original fairy tale than the sympathetic character audiences know today. Throughout the 2000s, Disney tried to modernize the story, but struggled to make Elsa work as anything more than a one-dimensional ice witch. In some drafts, Anna wasn't her sister at all, just a generic heroine who opposed her. Concept art from this period shows Elsa as sharp, angular, and sinister, with little resemblance to the conflicted character she would eventually become. The turning point came when the creative team reimagined Elsa and Anna as siblings. This gave the film an emotional core and sets the stage for Elsa's transformation from villain to misunderstood protagonist. Even then, early versions of the movie had much darker endings, including scenarios where Elsa remained the antagonist or Anna didn't survive after her heart was frozen. Ultimately, the addition of Let It Go solidified Elsa as a sympathetic figure, forcing a complete rewrite of the story. Most of the early drafts have never been released publicly, leaving behind only concept art, production notes, and scattered details from interviews. They serve as a reminder of just how close Frozen came to being a very different and much darker Disney film. The Lion King 2: Simba's Pride. Deleted material. Simba's Pride was a direct-to-video sequel, but it had a surprisingly complex development. Early drafts of the story were darker, with different fates for Kovu and other characters. Several songs and sequences were storyboarded, including an alternate version of One of Us that leaned into much bleaker imagery. Only fragments survive, some in the form of storyboards, others as rough demos released on soundtrack albums. Fans have long speculated that finished animation of these scenes exists somewhere in Disney's archives, but the studio has never released it. Unlike other lost projects, the film was completed, but the alternate versions remain hidden, suggesting an unseen darker side of the sequel. Inside Out, original Bong death scene. One of the most emotional scenes in Pixar history is when Bong sacrifices himself in Inside Out 2015. But what fans don't know is that the original death scene was much darker. Early story reels showed Bong fading away slowly, with Joy crying as his voice cracked and silenced over time. Animators reportedly found it too brutal for children, so the final version was softened. Bong still sacrifices himself, but his exit is quicker and more hopeful. The darker cut has never been released, but crew members have mentioned its existence in interviews. Made in Point Richmond. This one's unusual. Made in Point Richmond isn't a missing feature or series, but a private Pixar short film made for employees only. It was essentially a blooper reel. Inside jokes, parodies, and staff skits animated in the early days of the studio. The short was never meant for public release, but it did appear as a hidden bonus feature on an obscure Monsters Inc. DVD set. Because that edition was limited, the short has remained relatively obscure. Clips have been uploaded online, but many casual Pixar fans don't even know it exists. For lost media hunters, this one sits in a strange place. It technically survives, but it's rare enough to feel lost to all but the most dedicated collectors. The Black Cauldron, production material. Disney's 1985 film The Black Cauldron is already infamous for being one of the darkest Disney films ever made. But originally, it was even darker. Test screenings reportedly horrified children, leading Disney to cut entire sequences, including scenes where the undead Cauldron-born warriors melted gruesomely into sludge. The footage is estimated to be 10 to 15 minutes of animation. Some production cells and storyboards survive, but the finished reel has never been released. Disney has consistently refused to restore or include them, keeping the original cut buried. Fans consider this one of the most important pieces of Disney lost media, not only for its historical significance, but because it would reveal a much more terrifying version of a film already notorious for pushing boundaries. The Princess Academy, production material. The Princess Academy was an abandoned Disney film concept that imagined all of the studio's princesses together in a shared story. Development materials suggest it would have been set in a royal academy where characters like Snow White, Ariel, and Belle coexisted. The project was shelved in the 2000s, though some of its DNA may have resurfaced years later in Ralph Breaks the Internet, which famously featured a princess crossover sequence. Concept art exists, but little else. My People, production material. In the mid-1990s, when Disney was enjoying its Renaissance-era success with films like The Lion King and Pocahontas, the studio began developing a project called My People. The film was envisioned as a celebration of African American folklore, particularly drawing from the Brer Rabbit stories and other folk traditions. But unlike the studio's usual glossy animation style, this film would look very different. Artists explored quilt-like textures, carved wooden figures, and handcrafted patterns, aiming for folk art aesthetic. The concept was visually daring and would have stood apart from anything else Disney was producing. But the project ran into creative and political challenges. Executives worried about comparisons to Song of the South, which was already controversial for its racial depictions, and feared that My People would attract the same criticism. Ultimately, the project was shelved, and most of the work never progressed past concept art and early animation tests. A handful of pieces were displayed in art exhibits and later surfaced in online portfolios, but the bulk of the production material remains unseen. My People represents a what could have been moment, a rare chance where Disney almost embraced a radically different visual language and a more inclusive narrative, only to shut it down out of caution. Chicken Little 2, 2006, production material. After the lukewarm reception of Chicken Little in 2005, Disney briefly considered a sequel. Titled Chicken Little 2, The Ugly Duckling Story, the film would have shifted focus onto Abby Mallard, the so-called Ugly Duckling, exploring a romantic comedy plotline. Story treatments and concept art were drafted, but before production began, John Lasseter took over Disney Animation and cancelled the project. Lasseter was vocal about not wanting to waste resources on sequels he felt were unnecessary. What survives today are fragments of the script and leaked artwork, showing Abby as the central character. It's often cited as a project emblematic of Disney's lost years when the studio struggled to find its identity before the Pixar merger. The Incredibles Happy Meal commercial. When The Incredibles launched in 2004, Pixar partnered with McDonald's for a massive promotional campaign. One of the highlights was an original Happy Meal commercial featuring the Parr family, animated in CGI. Unlike traditional toy ads where kids interact with figurines, this one used Pixar's own animation team to bring the family into a fast food setting. It was a charming, slightly tongue-in-cheek spot and marked a rare moment where Pixar used its characters in promotional material outside the films. But because McDonald's and Disney ended their promotional relationship soon after, the ad never got preserved in HD quality. It aired for a short window in 2004, then vanished. Only VHS recordings and grainy YouTube uploads exist today. This commercial is intriguing because it's technically New Incredibles animation, but is stranded in poor quality and unlikely to ever resurface officially.